This story was told to me secondhand by my cousin. He is someone who has zero interest in fiction and no creativity, so I trust him when he told me this happened to him back in 2005 during a camping trip. He and 4 of his friends were illegally camping in one of the national parks in the Midwest. They were hiking well off the permitted trails and decided to camp in a very scenic spot with a great view of the surrounding landscape. It had been raining heavily the entire time they were hiking, but instead of lighting up, the storm only continued to get worse. It was an unseasonably bad thunderstorm, and the only reason that my cousin and his friends didn't turn around was because it would have been more of a bother to hike all that way back and locate their vehicles than it would have been to just set up camp. They knew that they would most likely get caught if they built a fire, but they did so anyway, as they were soaking wet. They dug a hole in the dirt and surrounded it with stones, and built a shelter over the hole by using tent poles and a tarp. They built up the fire so unnecessarily large that he regrets it in retrospect, as they could have caused a wildfire had it not been for the damp state of the forest. They eventually had to take down the covering because the flames were climbing too high. They all got moderately drunk, and made Bigfoot whooping calls into the night, and played a game where they tossed a small stone back and forth through the flames at each other, and the person who dropped it first had to forfeit his drink to the one who had thrown the stone. Every time the thunder rumbled, one of them had to crack open one of the cheap beers. The rain was so heavy that their shouts and loud cursing barely traveled through the canopy of trees. Later that night, after the rain had put out the fire, and my cousin had fallen asleep, the ground beneath him gave way, and 2 of the tents slid down the slope. When they reached the bottom of the steep incline, my cousin and his friend thrashed and cursed as they freed themselves from the tents, only to find out that they were waist deep in a bog of mud. They shambled back up the hill, soaking wet and covered in mud from the waist down, and woke up the other 3. They gathered their flashlights and went back down to collect their belongings as best they could. After a few minutes of searching through the mud and recovering what they could, my cousin felt something hard and smooth in the mud. Thinking that it may have been a tent pole, he pulled it out, and was utterly shocked when he realized that what he was holding was a bone. Figuring that they were the skeletal remains of a deer carcass, he tossed it aside and continued to shuffle around through the mud. After a moment, the tone changed, as each of them had found at least 2 or 3 more bones of varying sizes embedded in the bog. An argument immediately began as to whether or not they were human. None of them were educated enough in human anatomy to determine that with any kind of certainty. My cousin tried to calm everyone down, assuring them that they had to be animal bones that had been discarded, and this was obviously someone's dumping ground. But yet, none of them had found a hoof or an antler or anything that would make it obvious that the bones were not human. My cousin then stated that whatever they were, he didn't want to swim with them any longer, so he made a climb back up the slope. Then one of the others removed a bone from the mud that had a large metal piece attached to it. It appeared to be one of those metal implants that are surgically placed into someone to help support broken bones. That's when a gripping fear took a hold of the group. They quickly climbed back up the incline and packed everything up, dousing the smoldering firewood completely before they left. They didn't take any of the bones with them. The sun began to rise as they returned to the path, and it was decided that they couldn't leave without admitting to what they had discovered. They waited at a park station until it opened, and then admitted to what they had found. At first they were met with casual annoyance and disbelief. They were told to stay put until someone had been out there to confirm the story. After a few hours, the police arrived and questioned each of them separately. The Park Service attendants went from annoyed to alarmed. They were transported to the police station and questioned further for hours. They confirmed that what they had found had not just been animal bones. Initially, they threatened my cousin and his friends with jail time, likely just to keep them talking and to scare them into being honest. They were then told the Park Service was going to make them pay some kind of fine for the supposed fire damage. But after close to 8 hours later, they were all allowed to leave with their belongings and never received any kind of follow-up. My cousin was shocked that the incident never got any kind of notable media attention, and later stated to his friends the whole thing was likely a cover-up, and that the Park Service didn't even want to keep a paper trail on it. My cousin told me that between the 5 of them, they found well over 30 separate bones, and knew that there were plenty more still underfoot. I often wonder if my cousin and his friends stumbled upon a mass grave with dozens of bodies that had been uncovered that night by the storm.
I'm retelling this story on behalf of my departed grandmother. Truth oftentimes is stranger than fiction, and this story has been passed down through our family for years. It serves as a reminder that you can never be too careful. I don't know the exact year, but this took place during the 1950s when my grandmother was in her 20s and living in a very rural area of Kansas. At this time, she had already given birth to my mother. However, she claimed to be stepping out on my grandfather with another woman. I have no idea if that's actually true, but I don't see why she would lie. On one stormy night, my grandmother left my mother with my great-grandmother and drove out to her girlfriend's house. According to her, the two of them had planned to get drunk and listen to some records. She arrived at the dark farmhouse in the pouring rain and knocked on the front door, but did not get a response. Back then, when plans changed, you mostly didn't find out until it was too late. You couldn't send a text message or even call whenever you wanted. Figuring that something had happened, my grandmother decided to spend the night in the empty house anyway, so she didn't have to drive back in the pouring rain, and began searching for the spare key. She went around to the back of the house, the wind tearing at her coat and nearly knocking her over. She reached the back porch and continued her search for the spare key. Apparently, it wasn't in its normal spot, so she sat on the somewhat sheltered back porch behind a pile of firewood. She said her being too stubborn to go back home was what likely saved her life that night. She lit up a cigarette and sat smoking for an uncertain amount of time. She didn't want to break into her girlfriend's place, but she also didn't want to go back out in the rain and return to her car and drive back in these conditions, which had only gotten worse. She stated that lightning was crisscrossing all around the sky, and the wind was making the wooden fence lean at a sharp angle. She then saw a light come on from inside the house. It wasn't the light of a lamp or anything. It was a beam of light that flashed quickly. Figuring that her friend had returned home, she stood and pressed her face to the window. She didn't knock or call out, because she figured that the noise of the storm would just drown her out, so she just waited to be spotted by the window. The flashlight had disappeared into the other room, and after another moment, she caught sight of a man she didn't know, moving around way too slowly to be someone that knew the layout of the house. She only got a quick glimpse of him in the darkness, but she saw enough to know that it wasn't a member of the girlfriend's family. She thought it could have been a neighbor that she didn't know, but his suspicious behavior was making her uneasy, so she ducked down and decided to wait a while, despite the raging storm. After a while of hiding, she crouched beneath the window and would occasionally see the flashlight beam dance across the back porch from one of the inside windows. She figured if it was someone who was supposed to be there, they would have either turned on a light, or at the very least, would have stopped wandering around so slowly, as if they were looking for something. After what she suspects was a few minutes, the door to the back porch opened, and the stranger stepped outside and shined the light across the length of the porch, including the woodpile, which, fortunately, prevented her from being seen. She stayed hidden, and after another brief sweep with the flashlight, the person went back inside. The stranger could have easily found her, had he decided to take a look around, but she figured he doubted anyone would be hiding out there, given how rough the weather was. She heard the door slam again, and the stranger disappeared back inside the house. She peeked in through the window and watched as the man went upstairs. She waited in apprehension until he came back down to the ground floor, still carefully shining the flashlight around. He eventually wandered over to the front of the house, and then she heard the front door slam shut. Afraid that he may walk around the perimeter of the house and find her, she emerged from her hiding place and opened the back door. which was now unlocked. She carefully made her way inside and locked the door behind her. Without turning on any lights, she ran to the front door and locked it too, before looking out to the front yard. She didn't spot the intruder anywhere. Shivering, she locked herself in the downstairs bathroom and covered herself up with towels. She was very aware that the man would potentially still be in the house, or could even have his own key to gain access. After she dried herself off, she risked a quick run up the stairs and locked herself in her friend's bedroom. She had tried the light in the bedroom for a split second just to see if the power was out, which it wasn't. She then lay down on the bed. Exhausted, she nearly drifted off when a blinding flash came from outside, followed by a loud, thunderous cracking. It jolted her for a moment, but rational thought prevailed. One of the old trees out front must have been struck by lightning. She then fell asleep. The following day, she got up and searched the house in the daylight. There were no signs of her girlfriend or her family anywhere. She called her mother and then the police. An officer arrived a short while later, and she explained everything that happened the night before. Still unable to get a hold of her friend, the officer acknowledged that it may have been someone with permission to be in the house, but decided to take a look around anyway. After a while, he called to my grandmother. He asked my grandmother to describe what the stranger from the night before had been wearing, but she couldn't with any real certainty, as it had been too dark. Apparently, a body was discovered in the tall grass of the front yard. My grandmother's girlfriend returned home after the body had been removed from the property. She had been stranded several towns over the night before because of the road being washed out by the storm. The corpse was a man who had been an older friend of the family, but someone who most definitely did not have permission to be in their house, alone. As predicted, what had killed him had been a bolt of lightning that struck him down in the front yard. The man was carrying a 6-inch hunting knife in his hand, which had likely been what attracted the strike. It was suspected that the man came looking for my grandmother's friend, as she had rejected his advances in the past. But when he spotted the strange car in the driveway, he decided to enter the house cautiously and find out who was visiting. This is all just a theory, but the family stressed this man would have never been allowed access to the house by himself, and they had nothing of his that he might have been looking for. My grandmother thinks that the timing of him leaving the house and the lightning strike was off. She said it was roughly a half-hour window between her entering the house, locking up and drying off, before hearing the lightning strike. She doesn't think he was still in the process of leaving. She suspects he was on his way back.
This happened to me during spring break back in the mid-90s, when I was still attending college. At the time, I lived with my parents in a small community outside of Seattle, Washington. My parents were on vacation in Florida, so I had the house all to myself. Here in Washington State, especially around the Seattle area, we get a lot of rain, and this night was no different. My parents' house was a massive 3-story ranch-style home that was originally built during the 1940s. At night you could hear the creak and groan of the old wooden boards. My father spent a lot of money replacing some of the old infrastructure when he bought the place back in 1978, but the creaking never went away completely. It used to frighten me as a kid, but I eventually got used to it. That night I was sitting on the couch watching TV in the living room. Behind the couch was a large glass wall lined with curtains and a sliding door that led into a screened-in pool area. I nearly dozed off on the couch after a while, but was immediately startled by a loud noise that sounded like something had slammed into the glass behind me. With the storm still raging outside, I figured that the wind may have knocked something on the pool deck into the glass wall, so I got up to investigate. As I approached the curtains, I immediately felt my stomach drop. It was as if my body was telling me that I was in some kind of danger. I paused and tried my best to calm myself. I suddenly threw back the curtain, and there was nothing. There was only the visage of the empty pool reflecting the night sky, as rain trickled down through the overhead screening. I exhaled a sigh of relief, and decided to flip on the outside light to make sure the storm hadn't knocked anything over. The light switch was right next to me since I was at the far end of the wall. As soon as I flipped on the light, My eyes were quickly averted by a horrifying sight. Two figures dressed in dark hooded ponchos, standing on the opposite end of the pool deck, holding hands as the rain continued to come down around them. I was frozen in place, not sure what I was supposed to do. I could not believe what I was witnessing. Time itself seemed to slow down as the figure that was closest to the edge of the pool broke off from the other and started power walking towards the glass. The fear within me became so unbearable that I'm not ashamed to admit that I let out a pathetic yelp as I retreated back into the living room. I slowly backed away from the curtains as a dark hooded silhouette came into view and made its way to the coach light that was mounted to the adjacent wall. I saw the figure throw something. The sound of glass shattering and the light going out immediately followed. I turned and ran to the garage, which was located down a hallway that was directly behind me. Now, I have to pause here and explain that both of my parents are incredibly anti-firearm. In fact, they had both met at a gun control protest in the early 1970s. So, needless to say, there was absolutely no guns in the house that I could defend myself with. The best I could do was grab one of my dad's golf clubs from the garage. I then made my way to the second-floor guest bedroom, which overlooked the pool area. I grabbed the cordless phone off the nightstand and immediately dialed 911. I frantically explained to the dispatch what was happening. At the same time, I was trying to look out the bedroom window to see if the intruders were still prowling in the pool area. Unfortunately, I could not make out anything because of the pelting rain. The dispatch told me that units were on their way, and that I should remain inside the house until they get there. I then heard something that made my heart stop. I honestly can't remember if I hung up on the dispatch or if I accidentally dropped the phone, but I do remember gripping the golf club tightly in my hands as I kept my eyes on the bedroom door. As I stated earlier, my house can be very creaky at times, especially when you're walking up the stairs. I heard the distinct sound of someone making their way up the creaky steps. I backed away as I heard the footsteps emerge into the hallway just outside the door. It wasn't long before the doorknob began to rattle. It was soft at first, but then became more erratic. Violent pounding then shook the entire door. I braced myself for whoever was on the other side to break through. The pounding then turned into loud thuds, as if the person on the other side was putting their entire weight into kicking the door down. All the doors in my parents' house were entirely made of oak and were very thick all the way through. After about 5 minutes, I heard a second pair of footsteps quickly coming up the stairs. Soon after, I heard a woman's voice harshly whisper, "I see cops outside. We need to go." 2 sets of footsteps then frantically descended the stairs and across the tile floor of the living room. I assume they exited through the pool area, because moments later, I heard inaudible shouting over the rain, and when I looked out the bedroom window again, I saw 2 flashlight beams pointing in the same direction. The heavy rain and the screen structure prevented me from seeing exactly what was going on, but I'm guessing the intruders were surrendering to a couple of police officers. The doorbell rang, followed by someone identifying themselves as law enforcement. I put down the golf club and quickly went to the front door, making sure to look through the peephole to confirm it was police before opening. I explained to the officer that I was the one who called, and was relieved to discover that both of the assailants were arrested in the backyard. I was then asked to stay on the front porch while a couple of officers searched through the house. While I was waiting, I did see 2 people being placed in the back of a squad car that was parked out in the street. Although I could not make out any of their features, I could tell that one of them was a male and the other was a female. I would later find out that they were a couple of drug addicts who had been breaking into houses and apartments around the Seattle area, and were also both prime suspects in a murder case. The police speculated that they had somehow jimmied the lock on the sliding door. However, I might have accidentally left it unlocked, as I had gone swimming earlier that day. I didn't tell my parents about what happened until they got back. I didn't want this incident ruining their vacation. I will always love and respect my parents, but it was this incident that changed my stance on firearms. Sometimes they are necessary, because there are all kinds of dangers that lurk in the night. Hey everyone, Uncle of all units here, and thank you so much for tuning in. I want to give a huge shout out to my good friend Being Scared for joining me in today's video. The theme of this video was inspired by Being Scared's long-running series, Scary Stories Told in the Rain. I recommend that you go over and check out his channel if you enjoy those hour-plus long story videos, where you can listen to some scary stories while you play video games, or if you're digging a grave for your ex-partner's corpse. We've all been there. Anyways, thanks again for stopping by, and hopefully you'll hear from me again, real soon. Until next time, I'm your Uncle Unit, and as always, never forget. There's always a reason to be afraid.